फ्रेंड्स, वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल। आज की इस वीडियो में हम लोग डिस्कस करेंगे कार्बोहाइड्रेट मेटाबॉलिज्म, जिसके अंदर हम लोग पढ़ेंगे पाथवे ऑफ ग्लूकोज दैट इज ग्लाइकोलाइसिस साइकिल। तो चलिए सबसे पहले हम लोग पढ़ते हैं इंट्रोडक्शन ऑफ कार्बोहाइड्रेट मेटाबॉलिज्म। Glucose is the main source of energy to our body. When glucose is oxidized, the free energy is released, is converted into energy in the form of ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate. The energy currency of our body is ATP. If the glucose is oxidized without trapping the free energy, then much of energy will be wasted. Hence, the body prevent the energy in the form of ATP just as battery cell. It means ग्लूकोज जो होता है वो हमारे बॉडी का मेन सोर्स ऑफ एनर्जी है एंड ATP इज द एनर्जी करेंसी ऑफ आवर बॉडी। नेक्स्ट हम लोग पढ़ते हैं पाथवे ऑफ ग्लूकोज दैट इज ग्लाइकोलाइसिस। तो चलिए सबसे पहले हम लोग पढ़ते हैं व्हाट इज ग्लाइकोलाइसिस। नेक्स्ट हम लोग पढ़ेंगे स्टेप्स ऑफ ग्लाइकोलाइसिस। ग्लाइकोलाइसिस इज द मेटाबॉलिक प्रोसेस दैट सर्व एज ए फाउंडेशन फॉर सेलुलर रेस्पिरेशन। इन द ग्लाइकोलाइसिस ग्लूकोज इज कन्वर्टेड इनटू पायरुवेट। इट मीन्स ग्लाइकोलाइसिस में ग्लूकोज जो होता है वो पायरुवेट में कन्वर्ट हो जाता है and the glucose is a sixth member ring molecule found in the blood and is usually as a result of breakdown of carbohydrate in the sugar। तो चलिए हम लोग पढ़ते हैं स्टेप्स ऑफ ग्लाइकोलाइसिस। मेनली इट कंसिस्ट ऑफ 10 स्टेप। तो चलिए हम लोग पढ़ते हैं फर्स्ट स्टेप नंबर 1 दैट इज हेक्सोकाइनेज। तो चलिए हम लोग डिस्कस करते हैं स्टेप ऑफ ग्लाइकोलाइसिस। First step. In the first step of glycolysis, glucose is converted into glucose 6-phosphate. For this conversion, hexokinase enzyme take part in this reaction, and in this reaction there is a need of one phosphate group which is obtained from ATP is converted into ADP. In the next step of glycolysis, glucose 6-phosphate is converted into fructose 6-phosphate with the action of enzyme that is phosphoglucoisomerase. In the third step of glycolysis, fructose 6-phosphate is converted into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate by the action of the enzyme that is phosphofructokinase. Here is also a need of phosphate group which is obtained from ATP is changed into ADP and one phosphate group is added in this process. In the next step of glycolysis, fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is converted into GAP and DHAP. GAP means glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and DHAP means dihydroxyacetone. In this process, aldose is taking part. It means aldose is act as a in this step aldose is act as a enzyme for conversion of fructose 1,6-bisphosphate into GAP and DHAP. In the next step of glycolysis, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is converted into 1,3-bisphosphoglutarate. In this process, enzyme that is triose phosphate dehydrogenase is act, and in this reaction there is a need of energy, and the energy is obtained from the conversion of 2NAD plus into 2NADH plus 2 hydrogen ion. Then in the seventh step of glycolysis, 1,3-bisphosphoglutarate is converted into 3-phosphoglycerate. The enzyme act in this process is phosphoglucokinase, and in this process there is a release of one phosphate group, so which ADP is changed into ADP. In the next step of glycolysis, 3-phosphoglycerate is converted into 2-phosphoglycerate, and for this conversion the enzyme help is that is phosphoglyceromutate. In the next step of glycolysis, 2-phosphoglycerate is converted into phosphophenol pyruvate, that is PEP, and the enzyme help in this conversion is enolase, and in this process 1 unit of water is lost. And in the last step of glycolysis, phosphophenol pyruvate is converted into pyruvate, and here is a release of one phosphate group so that ADP is converted into ADP, and the enzyme take part in this reaction is pyruvate and kinase. So हम लोगों ने डिस्कस किया डिफरेंट स्टेप्स ऑफ ग्लाइकोलाइसिस। तो आप लोग एक बार इसको अच्छे से अपने कॉपी पर वीडियो को पॉज करके नोट कर लें ताकि हम अच्छे से आपको फिर से इसको एक्सप्लेनेशन लिखा सकें। तो चलिए, आपने नोट कर लिया होगा इस साइकिल को अपने कॉपी के ऊपर। तो चलिए हम लोग पढ़ते हैं द एक्सप्लेनेशन ऑफ द ग्लाइकोलाइसिस साइकिल, दैट इज फर्स्ट स्टेप, दैट इज हेक्सोकाइनेज। तो चलिए हम लोग डिस्कस करते हैं द फर्स्ट स्टेप ऑफ ग्लाइकोलाइसिस इन विच हेक्सोकाइनेज एंजाइम टेक्स प्लेस। तो चलिए हम लोग पढ़ते हैं एक्सप्लेनेशन ऑफ फर्स्ट स्टेप ऑफ ग्लाइकोलाइसिस। इन द फर्स्ट स्टेप ऑफ ग्लाइकोलाइसिस, ग्लूकोज इज कन्वर्टेड इनटू ग्लूकोज 6-phosphate, and the enzyme that catalyzed in this reaction is hexokinase. In the first step, glucose ring is phosphorylized, and in the presence of adding a phosphate group to a molecule derived from the ATP. As a result, at this point in glycolysis, one molecule of ATP has been consumed. इट मीन्स ये प्रोसेस में हुआ, ग्लूकोज जो हुआ वो चेंज हो गया ग्लूकोज 6-phosphate में बाय द एक्शन ऑफ द एंजाइम दैट इज हेक्सोकाइनेज, और इस रिएक्शन में एक फॉस्फेट ग्रुप का ज़रूरत पड़ा जो कि हमें मिला ATP से, जो कि कन्वर्ट हो गया ADP में। तो चलिए हम लोग पढ़ते हैं सेकेंड स्टेप ऑफ ग्लाइकोलाइसिस, दैट इज फॉस्फोग्लूकोआइसोमरेज। In the second step, phosphoglucoisomerase enzyme takes place. In the second step of glycolysis, the rearrangement of glucose 6-phosphate into fructose 6-phosphate by the phosphoglucoisomerase and the enzyme phosphoglucomerase enzyme, and the reaction involved in this reaction is isomerization reaction. It means in the second step only there is a rearrangement of glucose 6-phosphate into fructose 6-phosphate, और इस रिएक्शन को हम लोग कहते हैं आइसोमेराइजेशन रिएक्शन। In the third step of glycolysis, phosphofructokinase enzyme take part. In the third step of glycolysis, fructose 6-phosphate is converted into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and this reaction is catalyzed in the presence of phosphofructokinase enzyme, and in this reaction one molecule of phosphate is added. In this process ATP is converted into ATP. नेक्स्ट हम लोग पढ़ते हैं स्टेप 4, डैट इज एल्डोज। इन दिस स्टेप एल्डोज स्प्लिट फ्रक्टोज 1,6-bisphosphate into 2 sugar, that is dihydroxy acetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. In the fifth step of glycolysis, there is only interconversion takes place. In this step, triose phosphate isomerase act as an enzyme. In this step, interconversion the molecule of dihydroxy acetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Next, in the sixth step of glycolysis, that is triose phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme takes place. In the sixth step of glycolysis, triose phosphate dehydrogenase act as an enzyme. In this step, GAP, that is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is converted into 1,3-phosphoglycerate in the presence of triose phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme. In this step, NADH is converted into NADH and hydrogen atom is released. In the seventh step of glycolysis, phosphoglycerokinase act as a enzyme. In this step, 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is converted into 3-phosphoglycerate in the presence of phosphoglycerokinase, and in this step, 1-phosphate group is released and ADP is converted into ATP. In the eighth step of glycolysis, phosphoglyceromutate act as an enzyme. In this step involve only simple rearrangement of position of phosphate group in which 3-phosphoglycerate is converted into 2-phosphoglycerate. It means only the position of phosphate is changed in this step. In the ninth step of glycolysis, enolase is act as an enzyme. In this process, enolase remove a molecule of water from 2-phosphoglycerate to form phosphophenol pyruvate, that is PEP. And in the last step of glycolysis, that is pyruvate kinase. In the last step of glycolysis, pyruvate kinase act as an enzyme. The enzyme pyruvate kinase converts the phosphophenol pyruvate into pyruvate and ADP is converted into ADP. तो अभी हम लोगों ने डिस्कस किया ऑल द 10 स्टेप इन्वॉल्व इन द ग्लाइकोलाइसिस साइकिल। अगर आपको इस वीडियो को अच्छे तरह से समझना है, इट मीन्स ग्लाइकोलाइसिस साइकिल को अच्छे तरह से याद करना है, तो प्लीज़ वीडियो को पॉज करके ग्लाइकोलाइसिस साइकिल को अपने कॉपी पे लिख के एक बार ध्यान से पढ़ लें, एक बार में क्लियर हो जाएगा। थैंक यू, मिलते हैं नेक्स्ट वीडियो में।